Welcome to Cool Talk and my timeline. We're going to examine world events that are going on all at the same time from 1000 to 1 BCE, before the Common Era. Let's begin. The Phoenicians, an early Semitic people, they expanded their influence all over the Western Mediterranean, putting trade networks all over Tyre, Cyprus, colonizing civilizations all the way to west coast of Morocco. They were the link between Asia and ancient Greece. The Ionians were kicked out of Greece, but they went out and founded 12 cities in Asia Minor. An ancient Greek script was developed, and it was based on the Phoenician characters. Ancient classic Greek paganism bloomed. We speak about Zeus and Hera. And in speaking of Hera, these are the ruins of the ancient temple of Hera. And over here, this is a reenactment of what it would look like. At the time, it was the earliest use of iron in Greece. Fabrics were being dyed with using, guess what? Snails. The ancient Chaldeans used water-filled cubes to measure time and weight. And meanwhile, in Israel, King David ascends to the throne of Israel and Judah with Jerusalem as the capital, and the country would prosper under his son Solomon. The Hebrew alphabet would develop as well as Hebrew music, and subterranean tunnels were built under Jerusalem for the water supply. But by the time of Solomon's death, Judah and Israel would be divided. In Hebrew literature, we would have the Song of Songs, which could be poetic ballads between two lovers or an expression of God's love for Israel. A few years later, from Egypt came Pharaoh Shoshank. He would conquer and pillage Jerusalem. Then, around that time, the Egyptians and Assyrians began wearing wigs, even the mummies. Meanwhile, in China, by this point, the city of Peking had been established and the Qin script had been developed. The rational philosophy of the Chao gained over mysticism, and great strides in mathematics took place, such as root multiplication and the rule of 3. And meanwhile, the Babylonians made their peace with the Assyrians and developed cuneiform writing. Over in India, pantheistic religions developed, teaching the identity of the self and soul and the caste system. Over in Europe, the Germanic people began mass migrations into other areas, and the worship of the bull and other animals in many East Mediterranean countries developed. While the Phoenicians continued to settle in Cyprus, the Dorians conquered Corinth. The Iliad and the Odyssey was written, epics that were traditionally ascribed to Homer. And a new trading center was founded, Carthage, one of the most influential cities of all times. The capital of Israel was rebuilt by the Sumerians, but it would be destroyed again less than a century later by King Sargon II. It was a time of the Jewish prophets, and Elijah would struggle against the worship of the god Baal. The Assyrian Empire was going through a period of uncertainty. They accepted the rule of a woman, Queen Semiramis. She is said to be the inspiration for Columbia Pictures' logo. Here is Queen Semiramis holding the flame of King Nimrod, a Babylonian god, and it could also be the inspiration of the Statue of Liberty. The Greeks would extend their influences over the coast of Spain and southern Italy, founding cities such as Messina and Syracuse. But rivalries would develop among the city-states. It was the time of the First Macedonian War, and Sparta would grow in power. It was also the time of Greek art when it would flourish, and the time of the poet Hesiod. But on a happier note, it was also the time for the first Olympic Games. The Etruscans moved into Italy, bringing urban civilization and introducing the horse-drawn chariot. Soon afterwards, the first Roman king, Romulus. The Assyrians would conquer Syria, Philistia, Egypt, and Israel, and in battle they would even use animal bladders as swimming aids. The prophet Isaiah prophesied the coming of a Messiah. Babylonian music began using 5 and 7 tone scales, and in India, medicine was no longer tied to the priesthood. King Sennacherib of Assyria advances the culture. The library at Nineveh was opened, and it was an important trade center, Nineveh, as documented in its library and the Hall of Records. There was mention of mountain climbing, gardens, palaces, raising of animals and plants, and irrigation channels. But the Assyrians were harsh. They destroyed Babylon, the cities of Memphis and Thebes in Egypt, and submitted the kingdom of Judah. Meanwhile, among the Greek city-states, the Macedonians and the Spartans were at war again. It was also the time of the great Athenian lawgiver and statesman Solon. There was advances in literature, Greek religion, worship of Apollo, and philosophy. There was advances also in architecture, buildings made of limestone and marble, and the introduction of the Lydian coin. In China, the philosopher Lao Tse introduced Taoism, and by this point, the Medes, the Babylonians, and the Scythians were tired of the Assyrians. They went over there and destroyed the Assyrian Empire and divided the land among themselves. Now, Nebuchadnezzar II made Judah pay a tribute. It was the beginning of the Babylonian captivity for the Hebrews. Meanwhile, an ocean and a continent away, over in Mexico, began one of the greatest civilizations man has ever known, the Mayans. Cyrus the Great of Persia would overthrow the kingdom of Lydia. He would conquer the Medes and the Babylonians, freeing the Jews from captivity and aiding their return to Israel. His successor would conquer Egypt and make himself Pharaoh. Later on, Darius would divide the empire into provinces, introduce common currency, and regulate taxes and the army. In Athens, tyranny was overthrown and democratic reforms would be introduced. The same would happen in Rome as the monarchy ended when the last king, King Tarquin the Proud, was expelled and a republic was introduced. In literature, a Greek former slave named Aesop wrote the famous Aesop's Fables, which is still being read by children around the world today. And in Madagascar, finally, humans arrived, and they came from Asia. In China, we had the philosophy of Confucius, and in India came the philosophy of Buddha. Now, the religion of Zoroastrianism had its first recorded history, even though Zoroaster existed centuries before. Historians are not sure exactly when. In architecture, the Jews rebuilt their Temple of Jerusalem. The Romans adopted arched ceilings, and in Greek art, there was an emphasis on the humanistic. In India, the musical instrument, the veena, was introduced. The Babylonians had their banking system flourish as they founded the city of Persepolis. Now, we say that Bartolomeu Dias from Portugal was the first European to circumnavigate Africa. But now, there is some evidence that about 1,000 years earlier, the Phoenicians may have done it first. But historians disagree, as some say that this is a myth. Sardinia was captured by the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians. Then there was the Ionian War, a revolt against Persia. And there was also the Persian War between the Persians and the Greeks. And there was war between the city-states of Athens and Corinth. War everywhere. During all of this, the Romans would subdue the Greek trading city in Italy, Tarentum, and Roman plebeians were given the right to share in making laws. And Athens went to war with Sparta continuously. For a while, they would get tired of war and they would make peace. But then they would get tired of peace and they would make war again. This went on for 30 years until the Spartans crushed the Athenian navy. And the Spartans also used chemical warfare made of charcoal, sulfur, and pitch. It was a time of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman and lawmaker. And in Rome, Cincinnatus was farming his land. When Rome got into a war, they called Cincinnatus to appoint him dictator. He went, helped win the war, and then went back to farming his land. And the Celts. They would raid and put settlements all over the British Isles. Carthage would invade and occupy Malta, and the city-states of Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos all made a coalition to fight against the Spartans, but the Spartans defeated them. Rome would continue to expand. After a 10-year siege, they captured the Etruscan city of Velli. The Gauls would invade and sack the city of Rome. But then they would withdraw, and Rome would rebuild. This time with city walls around the city, they created war catapults, and they elected the first plebeian to be consul. The Romans were serious about not having a monarchy, and when a Roman consul, Capitolinus, was accused of having royal ambitions, he was thrown off a rock to his death. Over in China, to protect themselves against the Huns, the Chinese started to build a wall. Later, the Romans would build the Temple of Concordia. And it was the time of Hippocrates, the father of medicine. Socrates, the philosopher, was accused of corrupting the youth and was ordered to be executed by poison. His pupil, Plato, continued to defend him, and he wrote the Apologia and the Symposium. And Philip of Macedonia would greet his newborn son, the future Alexander the Great. Many Phoenician cities would break away from Persia. Now Philip II of Macedonia would defeat the Greeks, and he hired Aristotle, the philosopher, to tutor his son Alexander. And when Philip died, Alexander became king, Alexander the Great. In less than 7 years, he conquered all this territory that you see here. He never lost a battle. He went all the way up to India, getting up to the Indus River when his troops, tired, forced him to come back. But he did send explorers out to explore the Indian Ocean. Upon Alexander's death, he didn't appoint an heir, so his generals divided the land between them. Now, Alexander, open-minded for his time, or perhaps influenced by philosopher Aristotle, accepted other people's cultures and religions, but he also helped spread the Hellenistic culture of that time. And this culture would predominate for about 3 centuries until the Romans became dominant. Now, one of the lands that Alexander had conquered was Egypt. And when he died, his general Ptolemy I became the pharaoh. And this dynasty would last 300 years. Later on, the Library of Alexandria would be constructed. Greek explorers would venture out to explore those mysterious islands. Today we call it Britain. The Romans continued to expand and invaded Samnite. And the Romans would also build their massive, impressive aqueducts, the Appian Aqueducts, and the road, the Appian Way. It was also the time of Euclid, the father of geometry. And in India, the epic Mahabharata was written. The Romans would fight the Samnites again. This time there was full equality between the patricians and the plebeians. And Rome went to war against Carthage in what would be called the first of the 3 Punic Wars. Both Rome and Carthage wanted to control the trade centers of the Mediterranean. Rome won every single time, but it was a tough fight. Demetrius of Macedonia had fought under Alexander. Now, he murdered and raped his way all the way to the top to becoming king of Athens, but he was very hated by his people. When they fought against the Seleucid Empire, he was captured and left there and not rescued. He would die 3 years later. Greek became the predominant language. There was a Greek version of the Old Testament that was written, as well as a Greek history of Egypt. And on one of the Greek islands was built the Colossus of Rhodes, almost as tall as a Statue of Liberty. It was destroyed in an earthquake later on. And there was also the lighthouse at Pharos, Alexandria, both of them wonders of the world. It was a time of the first gladiator fights in Rome, and across the ocean, another civilization continued to grow in Mexico. The Mayans built the Sun Temple at Teotihuacan. A group of Iron Age people called Latine invaded Britain. They have been spreading their influence all over Europe. King Antiochus II of Chios was killed by his wife. And in Sparta, King Agis IV wanted to attempt agrarian reform and introduce a new constitution and also have the rich share some of their wealth with the poor. Well, the rich didn't like that, and long story short, he was strangled. Then his mother and grandmother were strangled over his body. Several city-states formed the Achaean League, and they went to war with Sparta. Now, Sparta was debilitating. They weren't what they used to be. And as you can see, the city-state of Rome has conquered most of today's Italy. They also went to war with Carthage again in the Second Punic War, which Rome again won. But it was a very tough battle. And also we have the dramatic effect of Hannibal from Carthage crossing the Alps to sneak up on the Romans with his elephants. And Hannibal won many battles and terrorized the Romans, and probably would have won if he had received reinforcements. There was a new dynasty in China, the Qins, and over in India, Emperor Asoka, one of the greatest Indian emperors ever, ruled over most of the Indian subcontinent, extended the lands from Bangladesh over to Afghanistan. Greek mathematician Eratosthenes suggested that the Earth was moving around the sun. He also mapped the course of the Nile River and made a very close estimate of the Earth's circumference. And the Chinese were continuing to extend the Great Wall. It was now 1,400 miles long. The Romans beat the Macedonian in a second Macedonian War, and Consul Cato the Elder hated Hellenization. He wanted to promote Roman thinking. In the meantime, Sparta went to war against Rome. Rome won. And then Antiochus III from Syria took Palestine away from the Egyptians. Then he went to fight over in Greece, aided by Hannibal, the general from Carthage. But they lost out in Greece, and Hannibal committed suicide. Rome would continue to extend its dominion over the parts of Europe, and it would go to war with Macedonia again, winning, and this time taking many slaves. Now, a male Macedonian slave would be sold by what today would be about $50 to $75, but females were sold to the equivalent of about $1,000. In Syria, when King Antiochus IV outlawed Jewish religious practices, the Jews rebelled, and Judas Maccabeus would lead the revolt. The Jews won, expelled the Syrians, rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, and rededicated the temple. This was called the Maccabean Revolt. And the Jews, till this day, celebrate this triumph in what is called Hanukkah. Rome would go to war against Carthage again in the Third Punic War, this time destroying Carthage. Of 500,000 inhabitants, 90% of the Carthaginians were killed. The rest were sold into slavery. Rome would also gain control in Asia Minor, Greece, and win the war against the Numidians in Africa. The books of Maccabees, written in Hebrew, would be added to the Septuagint in the Old Testament of the time. In Palestine, we saw the rise of the religious groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Also, despite Rome's dominion, Greek culture would still flourish, bringing us art such as this statue, the Venus of Milo. A civil war broke out in Rome, and Sulla, two-time consul and one-time dictator, regained control of Italy. The Suebi, a Germanic tribe, invaded Gaul, and Spartacus, one-time slave / gladiator, led a slave revolt, but he was crushed by the richest man in Rome, Crassus, who had his own army, and he was aided by Pompey. And Pompey and Crassus both became consuls. And Pompey would conquer Palestine and make it part of the Roman province of Syria. Later, he captured Jerusalem. During this, a Roman general, Gaius Julius Caesar, was winning victories in Spain, conquering northern Gaul and invading Britain. So these three men got together as consuls and formed the first triumvirate, a government run by Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Crassus. Now, I don't know why Crassus, the richest man in Rome, decided to invade Parthia, which was over in Persia. I guess he was jealous of Julius Caesar's victories. But anyway, in any case, Crassus was killed in the war against the Parthians. Roman culture flourished. Here are the writers Virgil and Horace, and the great orator Cicero. Then the Chinese reached India by ship, and for the first time, Europeans could eat cherries, as cherry trees were imported from Asia Minor to Rome. Of the original triumvirate, Crassus was dead. A rivalry broke out between Pompey and Julius Caesar. Civil war broke out. Pompey was losing. He ran away to Egypt with Julius Caesar chasing him, but Pompey was killed. Julius Caesar hooked up with Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and helped her consolidate her power. Unfortunately, the library of Alexandria, with all its knowledge, was burned to the ground, and Julius Caesar would be killed by Roman senators. Well, another Roman civil war broke out, and a second triumvirate was formed, this time with Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's grandnephew and heir, generals Mark Antony and Lepidus. But these three men were very ambitious, and they did not trust each other. Lepidus would end up being exiled. Mark Antony would run over to Egypt, marry Cleopatra. But then another war broke out between him and Octavian. Mark Antony and Cleopatra would end up committing suicide, leaving Octavian as the only consul and eventually emperor of Rome, retitling himself Caesar Augustus. Rome appointed Herod as the new king of Judea. It was a time of writing and poetry, and this is the poet Ovid. And also, the Julian calendar adopted 365 days and created the leap year. You see, the year is actually 365 days and a quarter. To avoid confusion, we have 365 days, and every 4 years we have that extra day to make up for the lost time. Leap year, created by the Romans. And finally, the birth of Jesus. And soon afterwards, the beginnings of Christianity. You can check out my other video on the history of Christianity, along with other histories about the Aztecs, Mayans, Incans, African empires, Rome and Greece again. But I couldn't speak much about, for example, Russia and how people moved to the north of Europe to begin Russia, and also, say, ancient Vietnam. And here we have the Mayans, of course, were progressing. There were a lot of Native Americans in North America that were moving about. But these videos would be more about culture than anything else, because we don't have the writings. We don't know the history, unfortunately, of these people. For example, over in Australia, I'm sure the Aborigines have many fascinating stories to tell that cross over millenniums, but unfortunately, we don't have their history, only their culture that we can study. But my next video is going to be about the North American Native Americans, and after that, a video about the Celts. But let me know what you think. Comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk. Thanks for watching.